Okay, welcome back. Oh dear, this could be trouble. Now 6.6, we're going to talk about developed schedule. And here, we're talking about how we modify the schedule as we go along and learn certain things about what's going on. So basically, the input we're getting here is coming from many sources. The scope statement is going to have a bunch of assumptions and constraints that are going to affect the schedule development. And again, we mentioned this earlier, there are two types of constraints: internally imposed dates and externally imposed dates. Well, these guys are things that we've agreed upon to do, and particularly if we're doing a contract, then we might have to uh, uh, maintain the execution of those particular dates. There might be weather restrictions, there might be governmental mandated compliance dates, and they're typically terms like start no earlier than or finish no later than, commonly used expressions. The externally imposed dates could be dictated by our stakeholders, by people outside the project itself, and they could be milestones that are connected to external projects that are running in parallel. The project staff assignments, and we'll talk about this more in Unit 9, we need to know when the resources are available for work assignments. And of course, resources have their own calendars with vacations and religious holidays and things like that. Labor contracts may limit the days a week a person can work. And in fact, one of the biggest constraints in any project is the relationship with the union and what the union will let us do or not do. OPAs will give us project calendars to dictate when no work can be done. It may be the shifts can be constrained not to work on the weekends and that sort of thing. Our tools and techniques for schedule development, there are a number of different things we can use. Let's take a look at a few of these. The schedule network analysis, basically, we've generated the project schedule already, and we're basically checking for loops and open ends just to make sure that we've done the correct job. The critical path method uses the earliest start and finish dates and the late start and finish dates without any regard to resource limitations. And we worry about float. If we've got positive float, then it means that we can delay certain activities without suffering overall delay in the project. We talked about this earlier in the last unit about doing forward and backward passes. Critical path method uses a single fixed estimate for each activity. No rule of 6, no beta distribution, just a 5 days, 6 days, whatever it is. And this leads to the definition of a critical path and a deterministic schedule. Now we can talk about float. It's the time a task can be delayed without delaying the early start of its successor. In other words, if we've got float, it means that we don't have to execute the task immediately. We can delay it up to the number of days specified in the float. A total float is the time a task can be delayed without delaying the project completion date. And again, this will be different from the free float. The project float is the time a project can be delayed without delaying the externally imposed completion date. So in fact, these may not be the same, the total float and the project float. The project float is a drop-dead date that we have to have it done. Total float could say, well, let's build in some project float here to give us some add time at the end in case we get an unexpected delay. Then to compute the likely finish times, we need to start at the beginning to do a forward pass. We start at the finish date to do a backward pass. And again, we can have negative float along with positive float. Now, schedule compression is an interesting one. There are basically only two ways that we can compress as long as we don't descope. Descoping is also a possibility. In other words, don't do all the things you said you're going to do. That's one way we can compress the schedule. In general, that's a bad idea. Crashing and fast tracking are the two legitimate ways to do this. So let's take a look at it. In crashing, we compute the critical path. Then we work out the cost per week to shorten that path itself, and then start with the lowest cost and do that. So for example, suppose we had a diagram that looks something like this. We have A, which is going to take 4 units to do, B, 6, E, 7, and F, 6. So we've got A, B, E, F as the critical path. And we see that's going to be basically 10 plus 7 plus 6, 23 units to get through the path itself. Then we can see that there's considerable float here for D and C. Well, suppose we work out the crash data. In other words, we're expecting to do A in 4 time units and cost $10,000. Let's say this per week. If we crash it down to 2 weeks instead of 4, then we're going to spend an extra $4,000 to do that crash. In other words, to get it done faster, we've got to spend more resources. That's going to give us basically $2,000 a week for crashing 2 weeks. So I can gain 2 weeks on the schedule here at the cost of $2,000 per week. Similarly with B, it's going to cost me $30,000 to do it in 6 weeks, so I can do it in 42.5 in 5 weeks. Ooh, that's expensive. That's 12.5. And if we go through all of these guys down here, the crash per week for doing it, we would start off with the very lowest one. Let's go back to A. We can do A in 2 weeks instead of 4. That's a good deal. So now by spending $4,000, I can shorten the schedule by 2 weeks. If I need to do more than that, then I go back to F. And F down here, I can shorten that down to 3 weeks. So now if I shorten it by 3 weeks, I'm going to spend an extra $9,000. So 9,000 plus 4,000, I can gain 5 weeks shortage in the actual path itself. Now you have to be careful when you do crashing things like this or this, may all of a sudden put one of these other guys on a critical path, so it has to be done with care. Now basically, when we do a crash, the compressed time is the most compressed time we can actually take. So to do that, work out the critical path, the cost per week, and start with the lowest. Now, for some of the problems is that it may not be possible to crash anything. It's for sure going to increase the cost, so you're trading cost against time to do that. And more importantly, it assumes that you can take people off one task and put them on another. And maybe in construction and areas like that, that's true. But in more technical areas, it certainly is not true. Now, the second thing we can do is fast tracking. Fast tracking is to do critical paths in parallel rather than in series. If we do them in parallel, we're going to shorten the actual time to get the project done. Probably we're not going to increase the cost because we would have spent that same amount of money. If we had to get expensive resources to do it, then that would increase the cost. But generally speaking, it should be the same cost, but we can shrink the time. But some of the difficulties is that when you do things in parallel, then you may force rework. In other words, when you get the two parallel guys together, you find, oh my goodness, you build it in meters and I build it in imperial units. We got to start over again. So it can force rework. It can increase the risk. It requires a lot more communication. It can cost more in the sense if we need new people that we have to outsource and buy them outside the organization, then it could be more expensive. The critical chain is the third way of doing things, pioneered by Ilya Bahu. Oh, I've forgotten his name. But so the idea behind this is really simple. If we've got two work packages, A and B, that has to be done, A and then B, and we say that A is going to take 40 units plus or minus 2. So it can take anywhere from 2 units to 6 units depending on circumstances. And B is going to be 6 plus or minus 3. The critical path method says, well, you're going to take 4 units to do A. We're going to start B on day 5 regardless. Now it may be we've got the delay because it took us 6 to get through here, and we've got a delay inserted here. But if we get this done in 2, what do we do with B? We waste 2 days. In other words, the critical chain says, no, if you can get this done in 2 days, then you start B on day 3, not on day 5, the way the critical path says. So in other words, you pick up the buffering advantages of doing things faster. You can start downstream activities quicker and then pick up the slack. If B, for example, took 9 units to do instead of 6, then you've only been delayed a total of 1. The idea is to take advantage of early finishes here, which basically tends to happen if the start date of each task is fixed, then we don't start until that actual start date begins. So the idea behind this is quite positive, and it's the thing you might think about using. Resource optimization techniques, well, we run into the situation, for example, when Sue has to work 16 hours to get a job done here, whereas Bob can do it in 8 hours in the next day. So to try to level this, we basically have Sue doing it for 8 hours in day 1 and 8 hours in day 2. And in fact, this is going to increase the critical path, but it leads to a more sane, more compassionate way of assigning resources to the project itself. It's going to increase the critical path, of course, but that's the cost. Critical path can overallocate resources. As we mentioned, we may have to level them, and that can be done automatically with project management software like Microsoft Project. The leads and lags, we can modify these in the simulation to see how sensitive the schedule is to adjusting the leads and lags to see if it makes any difference. Schedule compression, we can use the examples that we've talked about before to actually do that. And finally, the schedule tool is basically the product that we're going to use to do the schedule baseline for the rest of the project. And we want to make sure that with the integrated change control, any changes in scope and requirements may well have an effect on the schedule, probably is guaranteed to do it. In terms of the activities, we probably should have a code assigned to each one of those activities so we can sort of extract numbers based on those activities themselves. Oh, I apologize. I got a tricky index finger, an itchy trigger finger. There we go. Okay, so things like responsibility or geographic areas and so on, things that make sense in the project. Okay, the outputs from schedule development then are the schedule baseline, which is going to run the project itself. This is going to give us basically the project schedule, calendars, and project management update. This is the baseline for monitoring and control, and this is basically the same sort of thing except for the project itself. We represent this with typically a network diagram. We can also use Gantt charts or milestones as we've seen. And then the schedule data is the supporting data for all the assumptions and constraints that we've made. And the project manager has to check these continuously to make sure they're still valid. Project calendars are the days and shifts when resources are available. And then the document updates as we talked about before.